Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands took to the streets of Minneapolis Thursday as protests against the killing of an African-American man by a white police officer rocked the city for the third night in a row. Demonstrators set fire to the Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd precinct just hours after prosecutors said they're not sure yet if they'll criminally charge Derek Chauvin, the white police officer who pinned George Floyd to the ground by his neck for 8 minutes while Floyd gasped for air. In a video that's now been seen around the world, Floyd repeatedly gasps, "I can't breathe." 4 officers, including Chauvin, have since been fired but not arrested. On Thursday, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman was questioned about the delay in charging and arresting the officers.
That video is graphic and horrific and terrible, and no person should do that. But my job in the end is to prove that he violated a criminal statute, and there is other evidence that does not support a criminal charge.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz called in the National Guard overnight as protests raged in Minneapolis and St. Paul. This morning, Minnesota State Patrol arrested CNN correspondent Omar Jimenez, along with his producer and camera crew, live on national television outside the charred remains of the 3rd Police Precinct. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz later apologized to CNN over the arrests, and the crew was released. After headlines, will go to Minneapolis for the latest. Around the United States, thousands of people took to the streets to protest the police killing of George Floyd. Here in New York, police arrested at least 70 people during a rolling protest that began in Manhattan's Union Square. In Colorado, police fired tear gas and pepper balls at protesters who gathered at the state capitol in Denver. One protester was intentionally rammed by a driver who plowed their SUV into a crowd of demonstrators. In Arizona, police declared an unlawful assembly Thursday and fired tear gas and pepper spray at hundreds who gathered at Phoenix City Hall. In Louisville, Kentucky, hundreds of protesters gathered downtown demanding justice for Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old aspiring nurse who was shot to death by police inside her own apartment in March. At least 7 people were injured by gunfire that erupted as demonstrators surrounded a police vehicle. It's not known who fired the shots, though Louisville's mayor said no police officers fired their weapons. On Twitter, President Trump attacked Minneapolis's mayor, who called for the arrest of now-fired police officer Derek Chauvin over the killing of George Floyd. Trump tweeted, "I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis. A total lack of leadership. Either the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Fry, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I'll send in the National Guard and get the job done right," Trump wrote. In a follow-up tweet, Trump attacked protesters as thugs, adding, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Twitter responded by labeling Trump's tweet with the warning, quote, "This tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible," unquote. On Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order that could be used to punish social media companies, including Twitter, for how they monitor content. This comes after Twitter Tuesday took the unprecedented step of adding a fact-check label to 2 tweets in which Trump erroneously attacked mail-in voting. Meanwhile, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg Thursday defended his company's refusal to regulate misinformation, including false and deceptive political advertisements. Zuckerberg spoke to CNBC.
I don't think that Facebook or Internet platforms in general should be arbiters of truth. I think that's a kind of a dangerous line to get down to in terms of deciding what is true and what isn't.
Later in the broadcast, we'll have more on President Trump's attacks on social media with UCLA professor Ramesh Srinivasan. The U.S. Labor Department reported another 2.1 million workers filed for unemployment benefits over the last week, bringing the total of job losses since coronavirus lockdowns began in mid-March to a staggering 40.7 million. 1 in 4 U.S. workers has lost their job in just 10 weeks. The Institute for Policy Studies reports during the same period, the combined wealth of U.S. billionaires soared by $485 billion. California recorded its largest one-day jump in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began, with over 2,600 new infections reported Thursday. California passed the grim milestone of 100,000 confirmed cases this week, as Santa Clara County Health Officer Dr. Sarah Cody, who issued the nation's first shelter-in-place order in March, warned California is reopening its economy too quickly. Meanwhile, public health officials in San Francisco say the coronavirus pandemic has indirectly led to a spike in the deaths of unhoused people. Since the end of March, at least 48 unhoused people have died in the city, up from 14 people during the same period last year. Dr. Rupa Maria of the Do No Harm Coalition said, quote, "These excess deaths I see as COVID deaths, whether or not they were from the virus or from the complete failure of the COVID response from the city. They were deaths that would not have happened otherwise." Meanwhile, coronavirus cases are surging in southern states, including Arkansas, Alabama, and Mississippi. The increases came even as Politico reported health departments around the United States have inflated testing numbers or deflated death tallies by changing criteria for who counts as a coronavirus victim at what counts as a coronavirus test. In Pennsylvania, a Democratic state legislator has accused some of his Republican colleagues of covering up their COVID-19 status and potentially putting other lawmakers at risk. A video of State Representative Brian Sims talking about the situation has gone viral.
First of all, Mike Turzai, the Speaker of the House, needs to resign. And any member of leadership that has known what was going on, any member of Republican leadership that knew that members were testing positive, that other members were being quarantined, and did not tell those of us who were exposed to those members, needs to be investigated by the Attorney General. And I think that there needs to be prosecutions.
In immigration news, advocates across the country are continuing demands to release all people from immigration and customs enforcement jails, as confirmed coronavirus cases inside these jails in the U.S. near 1,400. Immigrant rights advocates led protests outside immigration jails in California and Washington state Thursday. In Burlington, Massachusetts, advocates replaced the ICE flag at the agency's Boston field office with a new flag that read, "ICE kills, free them all." Another national day of action is planned for today. Meanwhile, a 30-year-old undocumented Mexican immigrant who sued Immigration and Customs Enforcement 2 weeks ago and was later quickly deported by the agency has officially been declared missing. Hector Garcia Mendoza was part of a class-action lawsuit demanding the immediate release of all immigrants held at the Elizabeth Contract Detention Facility in New Jersey, where prisoners and staff have tested positive for COVID-19. Gothamist reports 4 days later, and without notice, Garcia Mendoza was transferred to Laredo, Texas, where he was then escorted into the notoriously dangerous border town of Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. Garcia Mendoza reportedly has not reached out to his family in Mexico or the United States. His lawyers have contacted shelters in Mexico and immigrant advocacy groups in Texas, but no one's reportedly seen or heard from him. His family is also concerned for Garcia Mendoza's health, as in the days leading up to his removal, he complained of chest pain and shortness of breath, but did not receive any medical attention from ICE. Mendoza's removal came despite a federal judge's order blocking the deportation. Advocates believe his expedited deportation is retaliation for the lawsuit against ICE. Garcia Mendoza had been living in the United States for 10 years. In Iowa, Tyson Foods says it'll halt operations at its Storm Lake meat processing plant after over 550 workers, or more than 20% of the workforce, tested positive for the coronavirus. Buena Vista County, where the plant's located, has the highest per capita infection rate of COVID-19 in Iowa. In California, over 200 workers at 8 Los Angeles area meat and food processing plants have tested positive for COVID-19. John Grant, president of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 770, which represents the meat packers, called on Smithfield Foods to close its Farmer John plant near downtown Los Angeles.
Outbreak is over 10% of the workforce, and it's dangerous. And the problem with this is that it's invisible, insidious, and deadly. And so what we do is, when a shark's in the water, you pull everybody out of the water and you make an assessment of what's going on.
In April, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to order meatpacking plants around the United States to remain open. The plants are home to many of the largest coronavirus hotspots in the United States. Dozens of COVID-19 deaths are tied to meat factories. Brazil registered a record number of COVID-19 cases Thursday with more than 1,000 deaths in just 24 hours. Brazil's second only to the United States in infections and deaths as far-right President Jair Bolsonaro has sought throughout the pandemic to undermine remain-at-home measures taken by state and local governments. Despite this week's surge in COVID-19 cases, the mayor of Sao Paulo, the Western Hemisphere's largest city, is allowing non-essential businesses, including offices, shopping malls and car dealerships, to reopen beginning June 1st. In Haiti, local social justice and human rights groups are warning hundreds of prisoners could be at risk of dying of COVID-19 as infections are quickly spreading inside Haiti's prisons. The Miami Herald reports at least 11 prisoners at the National Penitentiary in Port-au-Prince have already tested positive. Many others are presenting symptoms such as fevers. But Haitian human rights groups believe the number of infections is far higher as prisons are overcrowded with scarce food supplies or essential medication, and up to 80 prisoners are reportedly often crammed shoulder to shoulder inside filthy cells without ventilation. The United States has also faced criticism for deporting Haitians who've tested positive for the coronavirus. The Trump administration's announced plans to cancel the visas of thousands of Chinese graduate students studying in the United States. The move would impact students who've studied at schools that have links to the Chinese military. Republican lawmakers are also proposing to bar all Chinese graduate students from studying science or technology in the United States. Many educators have warned the moves could lead to a new Red Scare on American campuses. Meanwhile, Britain's considering offering a path to citizenship for over 300,000 Hong Kong residents if China moves ahead with implementing a new national security law on the former British colony. In news from Capitol Hill, Democrats have pulled a bill to reauthorize parts of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act after members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Republican minority formed an unlikely coalition opposing the legislation. President Trump had threatened to veto the bill, which would have extended FISA, that's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, until 2023. And in more fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, the next major round of the UN climate change talks has been pushed back a full year to November 2021. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman.